Into the wild I'll go, and into the wild I am. It's been a while, freedom child, since I left my roots back home. Into the wild I'll go, and into the wild I am. It's been a while, freedom child, since I left my roots back home.
Welcome to the Freebirth Society podcast. This is a radical space for women who are ready to celebrate their autonomous choices in birth, motherhood, and beyond. Together, we'll learn about wild birth through personal narrative, we'll explore the politics of birth, and we'll analyze everything that relates to our lives as women from a feminist perspective. Here's your host, Emily Saldea.
It's been a while, freedom child, since I left my roots back home.
I am thrilled to be welcoming back to the show my bestie, my birth wife, my co-creator of the Radical Birthkeeper School, the Complete Guide to Free Birth, and our soon-to-be 12-month midwifery school, the Matcha Birth Midwifery Institute, Yolande Norris-Clark. She is here today to help me crack open this pervasive myth of hemorrhage and to offer a sovereign resource that is so needed in alignment with what we know to be true of 20 years of birth work. We'll talk about what the word means, what it does not mean, and how we can demystify and therefore become unafraid of postpartum bleeding, both as free birthing mothers and as sovereign birth keepers. This topic is especially relevant as we are currently enrolling for the Radical Birthkeeper School, and one of our core missions through our teachings is to teach the truth about birth and to help you deprogram from the cultural spells cast upon us. Enrollment is open for just a short time more, so don't wait. Join us. Let us blow your minds. RadicalBirthkeeperSchool.com. All right, enjoy the episode. Welcome back to the show, Yolande.
Hello, Emily. It is an honor to be here, as always.
I feel like every time you come back, we've got a new baby in the crew.
Pretty much, every couple of years. It's the rhythm.
That's the rhythm. Love it. Love it. We're calling this episode the Freebirther's Guide to Hemorrhage. Our intention today is to create and offer a resource on this big topic. It's one of our most common questions and concerns that we receive. And it's a really big deal because it is such a big story. And so many women are walking with the story that they are bleeders, that they've hemorrhaged, that they almost died. And it's just a really big conversation. So we know there are not many or any resources out there on this topic from a sovereign perspective, from a physiological perspective, from a non-medical perspective. And so, excited, long overdue, excited to create this. Anything you want to add?
No, that sounds great. I'm excited to be here.
So I guess the first thing I want to do is throw you the question, how did you survive this most recent birth? You're 43, I believe. You've had so many children. Isn't it so dangerous?
I'm just really lucky. I'm really lucky, Emily. And the more babies I have, the older I get, the more I get concern trolled. That is, the more perfect strangers feel empowered and justified in telling me how unreasonable I am, how irresponsible I am, how crazy I am. Really, to think that this time I'm going to get away with it, right? I hear very frequently, again, from perfect strangers, how lucky I am to have survived birth as many times as I have, as though giving birth is somehow a much riskier near-death experience than any other aspect of life, which it's absolutely not. I mean, I genuinely feel orders of magnitude safer giving birth than I do driving in a vehicle anywhere. And really, the idea that birth would ever be categorized as this big risk that we take in life is really just not part of my reality. So this time leading up to the birth of our baby Margaret, who's 2 months old now, I was 42 years old at the time. Now I'm 43. But this time I during Margaret's pregnancy, I encountered more of this concern trolling than ever before. And, the truth is, and you know this better than anyone, I love bearing witness to the willing ignorance and the small-mindedness and the stupidity of other people, because then I get to feel so superior and so enlightened. And, that's totally a disgusting dynamic. And it's very much an aspect of my shadow. But underneath all of my dark delight, my dark reflexive delight in that, there's actually something really interesting going on there in the stories that people have about what it means to be a woman in her 40s who dares to simply be human. Because for me at this point in my life, there's a real fluidity to the way that I'm open to experiencing my body, and especially what it is to be a woman, and especially the transmission that is pregnancy and birth. I've got a lot of my own major issues, but but I'm pretty open to the process of life, I think. I think that's one of my areas of, anyway, comfort, right? And I definitely freak out about certain things like, bureaucracy and folding towels and missing jar lids. I take irrelevant things way too seriously. It's not as though I've figured anything out really, but when it comes to being in my body and being a woman and being a mother, I'm pretty relaxed about it. And I find it quite fascinating to allow other people's responses to that reveal the collective cultural conditioning and the collective cultural preoccupations. And one of those preoccupations is hemorrhage, or the favorite, I've heard this a lot. And I think it's, what's the word? Dysphemism, bleeding out. So I actually just learned the word dysphemism. It's the opposite of a euphemism. So instead of a phrase or a term that is used to soften a brutal reality, which we encounter all the time within the obstetric complex, right? Like calling the amputation of the end of a baby's genitals circumcision, or describing the physical assault done on postpartum women's uterus as fundal massage. Those are euphemisms, right? But free birth trolls really love to use dysphemism to attempt to frighten and intimidate. And I've received countless comments and private messages from people who will say things like, I'll bet you'll change your attitude towards the hospital when you're bleeding out, which is likely because you're so old and you've had so many kids. Bleeding out is like this term that people really like to use. So
God,
apart
it's
from,
terrifying.
yeah, it is. I mean, it's intended to be, right?
Of course.
That's the intention behind that spell. And it's a pretty there's an element of really hateful preemptive Schadenfreude that these people are already ideating. But what's clearly present there as well for many is really the true belief that being a more mature mother and having had a number of children already actually dramatically increases one's likelihood of bleeding excessively or experiencing hemorrhage or bleeding out. And I actually don't think that that's true at all, but I do think that the institution of industrial obstetrics, which of course includes medical midwifery, makes this true by design. So you and I, Emily, are going to get into a little bit of that a little bit later, but I want to wrap this up by saying that not only did I not bleed out after the birth of Margaret, who is my 10th baby, who incidentally was born after one single hour of absolutely blissful, totally pleasurable, incredibly peaceful sensations. And I was almost entirely alone, except for my husband, who was on the other side of the room, trying and failing, let's be honest, to take decent video of the birth. So that's fine. That's okay. It's not his genius or his job. His job really is to protect our children and to protect me. And he does that very, very well by protecting the perimeter, especially during my births. And he knows deeply what birth requires. Lee trusts me and my authority during the birth process. And because I understand birth and I know what's actually needed, not only for any birth really to stay safe, but for a birth to be as blissful as it's designed to be, my baby Margaret emerged after 1 hour. And during the immediate postpartum period, I was very, very shaky and pale, and I felt very destabilized postpartum, as I often do, as is totally normal in my experience for birthing women. But actually, I was really surprised as well to see that not only did I not bleed out, but I bled far less during Margaret's birth, my 10th birth at age 42, than I had during any of my previous birth experiences. I was actually a little bit shocked, really, to see how little blood I lost. Oh, and I want to mention too that way back when I was pregnant with my first baby, I actually had a blood screening test done. And this was one of the very last times that I had anything to do with diagnostics in the system or really the medical system at all. Um, and the reason why, one of the reasons that I disconnected myself from that system was this experience of having had this blood test and then being told that I had low platelets and that I was at particular risk of postpartum hemorrhage. And that was actually a really important experience in my life because hearing this news was just so immediately ridiculous to me and so laughable to me that it actually contributed to my realization that the industrial medical model really had nothing to offer me. Like it was not at all resonant for me that I had this supposed problem and this high risk of bleeding, and so I just completely rejected it and carried on with my life. Now, during my most recent pregnancy with Margaret, I was very, very fit and very healthy. I ate really well, but again, the fact that I hardly bled at all was still quite interesting to me. But what I also know after 20 years of witnessing births and supporting women in birth outside the system is that postpartum bleeding is also totally normal, right? Like it's not wrong or bad. It doesn't necessarily need to be scary. And there are some very convoluted, contradictory, really messed up ways that we have come to understand or misunderstand postpartum bleeding and blood loss and the idea of what hemorrhage is and what it is not and how we define hemorrhage. Uh, and I think this is just a result, again, of the many distortions in our understanding of how birth works and how healing works and how our bodies work fundamentally. So,
I just want to plug that one of your book titles in the future should definitely be called Dark Reflexive Delight. Something needs to be named that in Dark Reflexive Delight. You just like casually threw that amazing phrase out.
oh dear.
Yeah, I remember you texting me postpartum and being like, it's really interesting. There is no blood.
There's really hardly any blood. Yeah.
So let's shift into, I think that was a good segue into the overview. You know, part of what we want to get into is a bit of myth busting, some of what we've really come to understand in sovereign birth work and being leaders of, our communities where we are both tracking so many sovereign birth stories. And I want to, name and untangle a bit, some of the common, like the common consciousness around hemorrhage that many women are walking with, many women are, whispered while they're drugged up, and in these really vulnerable positions. And then they walk away holding these stories that have no real basis in reality. And yet it will be the story that keeps them tethered to a system that they don't actually want to go back to. So that's something, I mean, both of us see so frequently, and so many of our birth trauma debrief sessions are quite specific to unpacking these stories around I hemorrhaged, I had retained placenta and almost died. These are stories I hear regularly. And 100% of the time so far, when we unpack them, 100% of the time,
Mhm.
uh, it's either glaringly obvious that it was entirely manufactured by the medical providers, the pharmaceuticals, and the abuse that the woman experienced, or the woman had I would say what's the right word? Just a misunderstanding of what a hemorrhage is. And in
Right.
fact, she just had some blood
And like a normal birth, actually.
and had a normal
Right.
birth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And this is where it gets complicated because, when we as a society believe that women are flawed and broken and incapable, and then we carry that in a million different ways in our own psyche, we then look for unconsciously how that can be true. That is a really interesting part of birth trauma debriefs, or just listening to women's stories in general. I'll hear these completely normal stories and they're told so dramatically, as if I'm going to be like aghast that a
Mhm.
birth was 6 days long and that the baby came out and took 5 minutes to take a breath, and that the baby, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, so where's the part that's interesting? Like I haven't heard anything other than a mammal had a baby.
It is so interesting, and it also reveals that the trauma that these women carry, which is very real, is not a trauma that actually is a result of their physiological experience of birth. It's rather a trauma that has been absorbed as a result of the projection of this cultural misunderstanding, right? These
Mhm.
stories that women come, that are carrying, that they have kind of that they experience as trauma. It's not, yeah, it really is a testament to the power of this cultural projection. And actually, before this conversation, I actually Googled the mainstream medical definition of both hemorrhage in general and postpartum hemorrhage specifically. And I found the results really, really interesting. So the word hemorrhage comes from Greek or Latin or maybe both. And it actually literally means to bleed violently. But every definition that I found on Google, like just the first things that came up that are all, medical norms, uh, according to the medical complex, hemorrhage actually means any form of bleeding from a damaged blood vessel. And I actually didn't realize this until now. I always thought that the term hemorrhage implied a distinction involving some form of acute trauma with symptoms that involved, an alteration in vital signs or the loss of consciousness or threatened loss of consciousness. I actually thought that hemorrhage actually meant something, but apparently in the medical system, hemorrhage just means blood loss. So, it's going to be really hard for me not to announce that we have a hemorrhage situation the next time one of my kids scrapes their knee. But I
Mhm.
will resist that temptation because I know how powerful words are. And I know that speaking anything out loud is a form of spell casting. And this is all really, really important because what you and I both know, Emily, is that the term postpartum hemorrhage is used specifically to cast a fear spell and a pathology spell and a helplessness spell over women, and it really works. So this relates so much to these stories that you and I both receive in our birth trauma debriefs, where women will describe their experiences of having hemorrhaged, and then they actually tell us what happened in their births. And it's like, oh, either you didn't hemorrhage at all, as you just pointed out, had a completely normal birth, or the bleeding that you experienced that might have been more more so than you would have liked, given the context that the woman will then explain about how her birth went down. Those sorts of situations inevitably, in my experience anyway, involve interference and sabotage and ways in which her birth was, yeah, really altered by the presence of people whose um, involvement in the birth was really counterproductive.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that about the definition, because as you were talking, I was thinking, well, what would my definition be and how do I teach about it? And when I really get clear, I always say, it's not just blood loss. It's the combination of how you feel and blood loss, but it's more than that. I think the word I would use is it's unresolved. Like it's not resolving itself, and the mother would be declining. And what that literally means would be signs of shock. And this is beyond, and this is where we want to be really clear about this, because some signs of shock are not uncommon for a postpartum woman. So if we were to say things like pale color, shakiness, even some dizziness, and then some blood loss, even a woman fainting when she tries to get up. Yeah, there's things in the wheel of normal postpartum that feel, yeah, that are very normal, that I hear all the time, that I've seen a ton. And where is this conversation when it goes into unresolved? And that's actually an incredibly subjective track to follow, because you can only work it backwards. I'm sorry if this is confusing, but let's frame it this way. Yo and I both have never, ever, 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 ever attended a birth, a physiological birth at home, a sovereign birth, where there was no medical providers. Neither of us have ever seen what either of us would call a hemorrhage. But to be really clear, that doesn't mean we haven't seen blood loss. It doesn't mean we haven't seen women faint or not feel good or take many, many weeks to replenish themselves. That's something I'm thinking of, is some women will walk with the story that they hemorrhaged because they felt really drained and exhausted and weak for weeks. But okay, I'd also would just call that a very normal postpartum experience. There's so much recovery and replenishing, occurring in postpartum. And so I think, as Yo and I are with these topics, we want to get into some of the nuances here, because it's not true what the medical system, what your medical midwives are all saying, that this amount of liters of blood loss is hemorrhage. And when this amount of blood loss shows up on the towel and you weigh the Chuck's pads, and that's hemorrhage, and that justifies injecting the mother's body with harmful pharmaceuticals or shoving pharmaceuticals up her rectum, without her consent or knowledge, and da 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 da. Even a woman transferring because she doesn't feel good and receiving a transfusion, a blood transfusion, doesn't mean necessarily anything, because they love to do that. So yeah, it's like we don't have a black and white guide, because it's not like that. And the more that I'm thinking about your definition off of Google, again, we've never seen this in sovereign birth. I've certainly seen it manufactured in the system, which we'll get to later, but we have not seen, and I don't think we've actually also ever heard of any convincing story in a sovereign birth dynamic that either of us would truly give a label of hemorrhage, which begs the question, then what would that be? Right? And I guess what it would be would mirror what I've seen in the hospital, which would be blood. It doesn't have to be a faucet. Let's just say blood loss, and the woman is not recovering. She is losing consciousness. She has slurred speech. She is disengaging from physical reality and from her baby. She's, unable to do eye contact. She's leaving her body, and there is significant blood loss.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I actually wonder if the term hemorrhage should really be used in the context of natural birth or truly physiological birth. I mean, I have personally, as you just mentioned, and I know this is true for you too, I've never seen in my experience of birth and attending women's births what I would call a hemorrhage. I've only rarely ever seen bleeding that was concerning to me, although I have, and that was all, we handled all of that at home without needing to transfer. I mean, in the moment, I've been in experiences that have, caused me concern, and I have felt activated and compelled to to offer the woman various forms of support, but it was all resolvable at home. But when we consider that the allopathic definition of postpartum hemorrhage is excessive bleeding following the birth of the baby, again, what does that mean? Even the most mainstream websites, as I said, note that hemorrhage is more likely to occur in the case of surgical birth. Obviously, that makes so much sense because a surgical birth is an experience during which the mother is being injured, right? And yes, sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes that injury is preventative. It's maybe necessary to undergo the injury of surgery to save the life of a mother or baby. But given, of course, that in many places, surgical birth makes up 50, 60, sometimes 70 or more % of all births, we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that most surgical births are not actually medically necessary or life-saving. So that means that women are being put in a position of a high risk for a real hemorrhage because they're being given surgical births unnecessarily. And it's interesting to me too that over the course of the many years that I've been in the birth world, the elder midwives that I respect the most, who have the most experience in what I suspect at least somewhat aligns with the kind of philosophy that you and I espouse. I'm thinking of women like Gloria LeMay and Gail Hart, Joy Jones, Sister Morningstar. They have always tended to say that their belief is that a rate of surgical births that reflect medical necessity would be around 1%, maybe, right? And I wonder if that's even a high percentage. But when it comes to hemorrhage statistics, all of those statistics are collected in the context of industrial birth. And that, of course, includes what we think of as industrial home birth, home birth that's attended by practitioners who've been trained within the institution to view birth as a pathology and as a potential problem, and birth situations where they are the self-appointed superheroes, where they're present with the belief that they're there to save a woman from death. So that says a lot just about hemorrhage statistics as well, and surgical birth statistics too. But in a way, it actually doesn't matter that birth isn't constitutionally a wounding or a pathology, because belief is reality creation. The world really is what we think it is, and the body is what we think it is. And belief is expressed and reinforced through this continuous spell casting, word spells that actually bring the theme of deterioration and damage in the case of hemorrhage into being. It begins in the realm of the imaginary. And this affects women's consciousness, of course, but it's also a reflection of the consciousness of medical practitioners who are really just enforcers of an ideology. So medical practitioners have been force-fed this overall concept of pregnancy being pathological and of birth being punitive and destructive and damaging and dangerous. And therefore, we've metabolized this notion that the release of postpartum blood is the same as the very dangerous bleeding that results from an injury as a result of damage that's been done to a blood vessel, which again is like the definition of hemorrhage. But really what's occurring when a woman gives birth in a normal way, or in a vaguely normal way even, usually, is that she's releasing stored blood. That's really what it is. It's like menstruation or a parallel to menstruation, right? And most women who are lucky enough to experience a normal birth experience, which is actually pretty rare. I'm talking about normal from my perspective. I don't even know if I don't even know if we're really bleeding postpartum. I think we're more sort of releasing the excess blood that our bodies no longer require. So even if the technical definition of hemorrhage is bleeding, it's a powerful word spell to use the term hemorrhage to indicate this very normal bleeding. So what we have really is a situation where, again, all of this comes back to, and this conversation around hemorrhage, but also so many other conversations that involve variations of normal, high-risk situations, supposedly, and emergencies. It really comes down to our understanding of what birth is and how birth works. There are so many contradictions and so many discrepancies in the way that we understand birth. If you're coming from a certain perspective or a certain belief system, your understanding of birth is going to be very, very different from women like us who are immersed in the world of wild birth, because birth itself is not inherently traumatic, either physiologically or psychologically. However, when trauma occurs during birth, whether that's physical or psychological trauma, this is the evidence of externally imposed harm or abuse, I think. And I would absolutely argue that to some extent, every woman alive today is experiencing the consequences of having been victimized by, at the very least, psychological abuse that is inflicted on the part of the medical obstetric complex via the psychological engineering that's done through the media, through ancestral imprints. And it is trauma, whether, again, it's physical trauma or energetic trauma or psychological trauma, that is at the root cause of situations that involve excessive bleeding to the point of death being a significant risk, right? So one of the questions that I know that we both get all the time is, you free birth people, why won't you acknowledge, or will you acknowledge that emergencies can sometimes happen at a birth, as though we're somehow in denial that, yeah, things can go wrong, or there can be a number of variations of normal, right? But what I overwhelmingly observe, and I know this is true for you as well, is actually that things go wrong during births all the time in the context of interference and sabotage. And that's not just interference and sabotage within the institution. This is interference and sabotage that is often inflicted unwittingly by midwives, doulas, birth keepers of every kind, really, and even by well-meaning family members and partners. But there's also quite a significant burden of energetic and psychological interference and sabotage that we as women can bring into our experience that I think can also contribute to things not happening as easily as they might.
Yeah, and really almost no one is teaching about birth with years of witnessing with their own eyes through their own lived experience true sovereign undisturbed birth. And so we're caught in this cycle where well-meaning birth educators who are also traumatized, who don't know anything about physiological birth, but they think they do because they read a book or took a course, are just repurposing their programming. So many educators and coaches and women, well-meaning women unpacking other women's births, don't understand anything about physiological birth, because you can't understand it just intellectually through a book. The amount of deprogramming that is required to contend with these stories that live within all of us, I guess I'll speak for myself, has just, it's really only happened in attending, feeling fear about moms telling me they're bleeders, and then I go to that birth and it's in the back of my mind, like, I hope this isn't the one, I hope this isn't the birth, and then it isn't. It isn't the story, the truth about birth and the truth about the protective nature of birth continually is what has taught me or led me to have in what I guess I would call like integrative deprogramming. Yeah. So, we were going to give this overview of what it really is. And it's like, what really is it? A word that comes up for me a lot when I talk about it and help women frame it is dysregulation. That's a word that comes up, a lot in how I speak about it. So to me, it makes sense that the body and the psyche, after it's gone through just a totally average hospital birth, which I guess maybe it's worth for anyone who doesn't know, like spelling that out for a second, going through the humiliation rituals, being naked with legs, splayed open in stirrups, with many people staring at her, a light out of the ceiling, shining on her vulva, hands inside of her, really treated largely like a headless body. She's on drugs. On she's on an epidural, and that cocktail is local anesthetic and narcotics, right? So women are giving birth on fentanyl, which is a hardcore disassociating, drug. And so she's high and she's on her back. She's being sexually assaulted, and the baby is pulled out, and then the baby is cut from her. And so now the placenta was about to do its job, giving the baby its physiological blood transfusion, and it doesn't get to do that. And now the mom is separated from the baby's out of sight. She's drugged up on her back. Now strangers are with her baby. No one's speaking to the mother. There's a stranger in a mask and gloves, at her vulva, beginning to stitch or to go deep inside of her to retrieve the placenta. And now, the IV starts with the Pitocin. It was probably already on. And just wow, like that's a totally average hospital birth. That's not even like in the realms of the crazy shit we hear. That's just what happens. So in that, and then the fundal abuse, begins, and the mom's writhing in pain. And so they give her more fentanyl, and it's just so incredibly gnarly. And so in that, when you imagine that scene, or, unfortunately, many of you are going to hear that and put yourself right back to that memory because you've experienced that exact, story. It would make sense to me that the body would become so dysregulated by that level of torture, abuse, and drugs that it wouldn't be able, let's say, to regulate the proper job of what the womb and the placenta are now designed to do. So I say this kind of delicately because on the one hand, like with so many of these things, on the one hand, I don't believe that it is hemorrhage most of the time. If we're going to define hemorrhage in this conversation as an unresolved condition that would likely lead to death, right? The bleeding out phrase. Okay. We'll never know, right? Because the women in the system never get the chance to have loving care and to get regulated. So then we have to, travel over to our sovereign birth experience, where regulating at home is what you do. Like that, a hospital is of course a very last resort. And where we're standing, and the other, attendants we know who support this way, we're looking over here in our birth practice, and we're like, oh, that's interesting. All of us resolve with the families and regulate at home. Well, that's so interesting, because then we talk to medical midwives and they say things like, I see 3 hemorrhages a month. And then I, as a doula in the system, saw, air quotes, hemorrhage almost every time I went to a birth in the system. Now, this is, I hope you guys are following us, that it's like, what is it? Of course things are being manufactured, but then also women aren't even giving the chance to resolve in any sort of holistic, normal, humane way. I do think many of the circumstances where it's called hemorrhage is bullshit. And also, if anything was going to cause severe dysregulation, it's the scene I just described, right? Of course. I mean, what would dysregulate a new mother more than being drugged and disconnected from her baby and being abused for hours, and then having people physically jump on top of her swollen, womb that just gave birth, after being sexually assaulted? Like, this is very real. This is crazy. And so if there was going to be dysregulation, that makes sense to me. That would be very hard for the body to keep up with. And yet, I do think most of them do.
Yeah. I think there's also another important dynamic to point out here, and that is that I think a lot of midwives have been taught how to justify their own existence by claiming hemorrhage or naming a relatively normal postpartum experience as hemorrhage, so that they can, yeah, as I just said, justify their presence at a birth. And again, I don't think this is not nefarious, it's not conscious, it's part of how the dynamic is set up. It's part of the hazing process of undergoing medical midwifery training. They need to be needed. It's a heroic venture to become an industrial midwife.
Well, and the rules and regulations, the standard rules and regulations of third stage management are important to understand here with medical midwifery, because medical midwives are trained and choose to believe that they're required to interrupt a physiological third stage. So women birthing with medical midwives, you can be in your bed, you could be in your bathtub, doesn't matter. You are going to have really dangerous disruption. And third stage is the birth of the placenta. And so what that means is baby comes out and they are required to begin vigorous rubbing of baby. They are required to suction baby, or maybe they're just going to practice because they just took that course, to re-up their certification. And maybe they'll bag your baby, because they're just practicing. And then they're going to give you a shot of Pitocin, whether you like it or not. And oof, if I had a dollar for how many stories I hear of women saying, well, my midwife won't do that. My midwife, she carries it just in case, but she doesn't just use Pitocin. Like, she's willing to betray her license. Like, she even listens to your podcast. I'm like, uh-huh, okay, well, best of luck with that. And then 6 months later, we're doing a birth trauma debrief. And she's like, she did exactly what you said.
Yeah.
So it's because you matter way less than her license. Hello, this is why she chose it. Anyway, third stage active management. Yeah, shot a pit, vigorous rubbing, getting it as involved as they want. And then, yeah, maybe they keep the cord connected versus in the hospital, they cut it. That might be the only like redeeming thing. And then I feel like I'm missing something. Oh, and then getting the placenta out. So the Pitocin, not really optional. And then just like at the hospital, you're either going to have manual removal, where they go in elbow deep and scrape the placenta out of you, or they will do that with a combination of the fundal abuse that we described earlier. And so exact same situation as a hospital, it really might be the case that after all of that horrific disruption, your body doesn't regulate very well. Now, it also might be the other option where you are absolutely fine, but the midwife knows nothing about physiological birth and doesn't know how to support you in resolving. And so, again, this is where it blows my mind, the cognitive dissonance of our culture of women saying they want a natural birth and then hiring a medical provider. And I know it's like, because they just don't freaking know, but a lot of women do actually know because they listen to this podcast and they think they found the unicorn. And, my friends, there are no unicorns. There just are no unicorns. There are only women who attend birth in integrity. And if you have a license, I don't trust you. How can you? How are you trustworthy if you choose to be a state-owned agent that agrees to disrupt one of the most vulnerable aspects of keeping a birth safe, which is third stage, the delivery of the placenta? So, blah. Okay. So, I also wanted to name in this episode, that we all carry this spell that has been casted on us multi-generations, that our grandmothers or great grandmothers, there's this like ambiguous time at our backs over our shoulder where women were dying and bleeding out left and right from hemorrhage. And it is so clear. It's just so like accepted. And we all know it deep in our psyche that the only reason we've stopped dying is that medical providers have some sort of fairy dust that they sprinkle on us, and now we're surviving, except of course for the women in the hospital who aren't surviving. No one talks about them. No one talks about the amount of women in North America who are dying on surgical tables from hemorrhage. No one talks about that because there is this really powerful hold of the narrative, the cultural narrative, that somehow medical providers sprinkle something special to keep us alive and to keep us safe from this really dangerous biological act that all mammals do. And seemingly all the other mammals do pretty well with it. But we're this really special, it's because we start walking, so early. Well, it's like there's all these like interesting, like our hips just aren't wide enough. And, we have all these unique reasons why we are the dying species that needs this
Mm-hmm.
special fairy dust, which I guess we would call Pitocin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love Sister Morningstar's amazing imagery. She talks about, the fact that it's just so mysterious that we don't come across mother deer in the forest surrounded by blood with their babies dead beside them because they can't nurse because the mother has died of postpartum hemorrhage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, the animals can do it. It's just us. And so then, and of course, what's so exciting about this study we're going to do, and but just through our own lived experience, like, well, where are all of these mothers in the sovereign birth world bleeding out and dying? Where are they? I don't know of any of them. Now, that's not to say it doesn't exist. I have no idea. I can only speak from what I know to be true. But from what I know to be true, I have never once, not one time, seen or heard of a situation where a mother died from any complications at home. But specifically, we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
blood loss. Yeah. So,
Yeah. I want to mention something else too. There's sort of another element to all of this that I've been thinking about a lot lately. As you know, I've been studying holistic health and self-healing for many years, and I'm going to be at the Matriarch Rising Festival leading workshop
hey,
on self-healing and supporting child and family health for mothers and sharing my own approach to supporting the resolution of our healing cycles. And my approach is grounded in many ways by the work of the late German doctor Rika Geert Hammer, who observed and documented what he called the 5 biological laws, which I call the Germanic healing framework. And what I find especially fascinating about postpartum hemorrhage, or this idea of postpartum hemorrhage or bleeding postpartum, is that bleeding in general involves blood vessels, and postpartum bleeding involves the uterine muscle and the process of involution of the uterus during the immediate postpartum period. And according to Hammer's framework, any issue involving the muscular structure or the vascular smooth muscle system of the body is related to what he called a biological conflict involving self-devaluation. And what I've noticed in the stories that I've received from mothers over the years who've experienced what they describe as postpartum hemorrhage, whether or not this, aligns with my personal definition of what hemorrhage is or should be, which again would involve uncontrollable bleeding and what you described so well as the sort of just perpetual, persistent dysregulation on a series of symptoms that, would indicate a true threat to her survival. But anyway, bleeding of whatever kind that verges on excessive. What many of these women share when they really start to unpack their stories is that they have inadvertently or unconsciously created birth situations that involve a significant degree of both fear and lack. So, lack of really truly nourishing resources, lack of support, lack of trust, lack of confidence, the insertion of the presence of medical professionals who are actually not there to serve the woman's best interest, right? And every single story I've encountered of this kind that involves the story of hemorrhage uh, incorporates self-devaluation on some level. And this includes the experiences that I've personally had when I've witnessed and supported the births of women who have experienced not what I would call hemorrhage, but a lot of blood. So an amount of blood that's made me feel a little bit uncomfortable and has inspired me to, take action to support the woman, specifically in allowing her body to calibrate. So yeah, there's just such an interesting emotional and energetic component that I think we don't really take into account because what's happening in the hospital and what's happening in these industrial home birth situations is not just actions taken on the part of providers, so-called providers, that are encouraging or precipitating more blood loss than is necessary. But it's also the atmosphere of fear and all of the choices that the mother made leading up to this experience where she ends up really being completely unsupported and and experiencing an expression of a lack of self-value and self-love in the way that her body is responding to birth and motherhood, right? I mean, these are profound, really like deeply held themes that show up again and again in our culture as women and as mothers.
And zooming out, like how many women have we supported? Do we know that are in our communities that have been our clients who walk with the story, I hemorrhaged, who, feel like they have lots of proof of that in their industrial births, and then they free birth and bleed the perfect amount. And it's like, oh, that's so interesting that you just magically didn't hemorrhage all of a sudden when you did what you wanted and weren't brutalized in your birth. Like it's so unsurprising. And I
Yeah.
think I want to touch on the walking with the story piece, and then let's end with, as sovereign birth workers, you've mentioned a couple of times, if a woman's bleeding so much that you do feel a little uncomfortable, how does one support a woman to resolve? I think we should definitely name some real steps there. But before we do that, I just want to name how frequent in both of our coaching practices, women tell us these stories that all essentially have this gaslighting um, messaging to the woman, which is, well, let me back up. It's like this. I had retained placenta and I almost died. Or, in my last birth, I hemorrhaged, or I'm coming to you because I've had 3 hemorrhages with my 3 births, but I don't want to go back. And so how do I prevent hemorrhage? Right. So the women come with these big, big, big stories. I mean, women really believing that and having been told and then believing that they almost died. I mean, woo, that's really big. That is really scary. That's almost enough, you could say, to keep someone tethered to the system. So these brave women are coming forward, basically getting interested in talking with us about how we could explore that story. So the common denominator is that medical providers, in various creative ways, are letting women know postpartum, you just didn't realize how close you were to death. I have so many women tell me, well, the thing is, I felt fine, but my midwife said that you can feel fine and still just die. And so these women are so deeply gaslit in this really precious time in our brains. What's going on postpartum, what's going on during birth, it's so precious. It's so vulnerable. Oh my goodness. And you're in really a not everyone maybe. I mean, with a lot of disruption, maybe not, but you're supposed to be, the design is that you're set up to be in a state of hypnosis. So you are very easily influenced. These stories can get really deep in your subconscious when someone is casting a spell, as Yo says, in a state of hypnosis, right? Like conscious hypnosis, someone puts you into that state so that they can cast positive spells in your brain. But this is all happening, it's the dark side of it. So these women are walking with these stories that are deep in their subconscious, and they're grappling with this kind of bizarre concept where they're like, I felt fine, and yet I almost died. And so, if you're listening to this and you relate to that, like you're who I'm talking to, because that is not logical. That is not how our bodies work. That is one of the most epic examples of successful fracture and outsourcing and disorientation from evil outside influence. It is not true. And in any other circumstance, you don't just have your appendix burst. You don't just break your arm. You don't just have I mean, I don't know. There's like so many, it's just so silly. It's not possible that you almost died internally from your own body and had no idea. That is not how the body works. The body is designed to give you messages and to get your fucking attention. That's its job, is to get your attention, right? It is so nonsensical when you really just stop and think about it, but it's in the ignorance and in the spell of this hemorrhage lineage that we all apparently come from, that everyone was dying left and right until the fairy dust and until we were saved, right? It's like so deep in our consciousness that then women can be told in their births that they almost died, even though they felt fine. I mean, if
Mhm.
you can trick someone into believing that, you could actually convince them that they have a magical flu that they have no symptoms of, right? That they should cover their face for 2 years even though they feel fine. I mean, you can convince them that men can give birth. That, I mean, you can convince them of anything if you can separate a woman from her own body that much that they will believe. And I am not making fun of, anyone who is grappling with this story. It's to I'm trying to like poke the absolute nonsense of that story so that you can really have permission to question it, because it's very likely that no one in your life is creating any space for you to question the bullshit propaganda you've been told.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And it's not a problem to not feel fine after giving birth.
And then there's
It's not
that.
a it's not a problem to feel dysregulated, to feel panicked, to feel like you're in shock, to experience a state of shock after we give birth, because we've just undergone an enormous transformation and initiation, and our bodies have the capacity to regulate and to heal. I often feel, yeah, very very uncomfortable right after I give birth, as well as feeling ecstasy and bliss and adoration for my baby and incredible clarity of mind, actually. It's okay for those paradoxes to exist.
God, it's so predatory. Like, can you imagine telling a new mother that she just doesn't really know? She just doesn't really get how she feels. And that I need to shoot you up with drugs you say you don't want and put stuff in your bum. I mean, God,
Yeah.
it's so dark. It's so fucking dark. Yes. So then let's flesh that out a bit, because this is another aspect of the myth busting that's important, because it is in our own ignorance where this shit can be perpetuated. And if you think feeling shaky and, being a little, like a little, I'm going to say overwhelmed for lack of a better word, the stuff that Yo just described. eh, I mean, I've really heard the whole gamut of, women have thought that they were hemorrhaging because they didn't feel an immediate connection to their baby. Like, I've just heard so many creative ways to explain that something was definitely wrong when there are no facts of anything being wrong. So again, it is in our own ignorance of not knowing and understanding physiological birth that these predatory systems can continue harming us. So we have to share stories, we have to learn, right? So signs of shock that are leading into an unresolvable issue is going to be clear because you are going to work to resolve them. And that will lie the information. So Yo and I are both saying that when we are with women who feel, it just seems like they just need a little extra support. They're not maybe the radiant, warm, glowy, super present, vigorous, like, there's like a certain, there's a full spectrum, of course, of how women are postpartum. Oh, I also want to say before we get into signs that just another thing worth mentioning around debriefing hemorrhage stories that I know you're gonna resonate with this, is that when women come to me to unpack hemorrhage home birth stories, almost across the board, one of the things that they will all have as a common denominator is they birthed wherever they were, and then the medical midwife insisted that they move, that they get out of the water, that they get onto the bed, that they start the third stage management, they're not in the right position. The medical midwife won't like her being in the water because it's hard for her to gauge her blood loss. There's all these fantastical reasons why the medical midwife needs to come in and fuck with this perfect bubble that is here, that is happening with this family. And then shocker, a woman is forced to get out of the tub, to do something she doesn't want to do, to walk when she's not ready to, and there might be some dysregulation. Well, that makes sense. That sounds absolutely insane to me, to suggest a mother moves within 15 minutes of her giving birth. My goodness, how selfish, how deranged, really. So, again, this might be your story, and you can ask yourself, if you walk with this story, I'm a bleeder, I hemorrhaged, I needed that pit, the midwife saved my life, blah, blah, blah. What really happened, and how did you feel, and what facts do you have? Right? Like, really get clear on that, and what happened in the room, and how were you supported or not supported? And that's going to give you a lot of interesting ingredients to work with how this story gets made up. So let's end this conversation with, as sovereign birth workers, you've mentioned a couple times bleeding too much that it makes you feel a little uncomfortable. And so that will call you to support the mother in particular ways to help her resolve. Why don't you, really articulate what that means?
I mean, I think first we have to actually be present with what is real. So our discomfort doesn't also necessarily mean that there's a problem. So we have to actually assess whether or not we're projecting something onto this mother. So that's, I think, the first course of action. And, we learn to do that in a split second, like check in with yourself. What am I, like, what's actually going on with me?
What are the
And
facts?
what are the facts and what belongs to me and what actually doesn't belong to me as a birth witness.
Learn how
And
to do
then
all this in the Radical Birthkeeper School.
there we go. And then just what is required to support a mother in the recalibration of her body. And that is the atmospherics have to be attended to. So if you, as the birth keeper, are projecting fear and feeling fear, the mother's going to be feeling that, and her body is going to have a response to that as well. If any additional people in the room are agitated or anxious or, creating drama unnecessarily, that needs to be sort of addressed and attended to, or at least acknowledged and worked with in a very subtle and skillful way. And then the mother herself might be feeling a lot of fear because of this story that she might be carrying. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. And just the way that we speak to mothers makes a huge difference. So I always, especially when there's some additional energy or a sense of drama or some fear going on in the room, I am going to respond to that by actually really softening myself and attending to my energy, and my voice will become much more calm. So I'm going to have a kind of contrasting response to additional drama or high energy. And then just in a practical way, what is it that supports the uterus in stopping bleeding, in the contractions and expansions that will stop bleeding? And that really has a lot to do with the hormonal balance of the mother. So what is it that produces the oxytocin that's required for the uterus to do its work? Again, that's calm, a sense of love and connection, and of course, the mother nursing. So that's something that's really important. Is the mother connecting with her baby? Is the environment conducive to the mother connecting with her baby? Many mothers will not necessarily be ready to breastfeed immediately, but just ensuring that the mother is skin to skin with her baby. So there's a lot of women who wear bras during birth. I think that that's a factor that creates a physical, literal barrier between the baby and the mother. So supporting the mother in getting naked or being naked, and then just nourishment, food, water, supporting the mother in cuddling her baby and lying down as well. I think if we're upright, that can create a lot of destabilization. Sometimes just lying back can be supportive of that recalibration. And then often, if there are some different things involved if the placenta has yet to emerge. If there really is a lot of bleeding that seems uncontrollable, I have been in a very rare number of situations where it has seemed pretty clear to me that the next move is to support the mother very, very calmly, very easily, very lovingly in birthing her placenta. So that can be an important thing to do. But it's very rare that it's come to that. Most of the time, I'm not pushing the birth of the placenta whatsoever. And again, mothers will know. So I'm not ever dictating to a mother what needs to happen. I am responding to her communication and I'm honoring the process that's right for her. There is no formula to this. It's always very, very unique to each specific woman and each specific situation and the relational dynamics in the room and how her partner is supporting her or not. And again, what I found is that excessive blood or more blood that I'm comfortable with, or the more blood that the mother's comfortable with, really always fundamentally comes down to uh, a sense of not really being supported. So, in what way can I support this mother and allow her to feel that she is really being held and loved and nurtured so that she can then hold and love and nurture her baby? Yeah, so it's really obvious stuff for the most part. There's nothing magic about it. But these are factors that are largely absent from industrial birth dynamics, including the industrial birth dynamics that are imported into a home situation.
Yeah, I would add some logistical stuff that again is like so obvious. It's almost silly to mention, but it can feel nice to have some, yeah, real practical things in your back pocket if you're new to this. And I would really only implement any of this uh, if, which is not likely, it's not common, but if it felt to me like the mother was dysregulated. So that's not going to be the majority of women that I've attended, but every now and then um yeah, every now and then, I'm doing stuff without her noticing. Like I'm noticing her color. I'm noticing everything. I'm noticing everything that's happening as she meets her baby, but no one knows anything. I'm not saying any of it, but I'm paying attention to all of it, right? And so sometimes I will um do eye contact with her. Like I'll call her name and I'll be like, "Hey, how you feeling?" And just look her in the eyes. And a couple of times it's like pretty obvious, like, "Oh, she's not actually doing so great. She's on it. Maybe she won't even look me in the eyes, or maybe she, yeah, it's just kind of like not fully there. You can feel it, right, if you're paying attention. And so that those would be the times when I would be more action oriented. But like Yo said, women, it's more likely for a woman to be like, is this bleeding okay? Am I okay? Which is fine. That's normal and great and totally understandable to ask that, especially if you have a story around your blood. Um, anyway, so some logistical stuff would be keeping her warm, right? Keeping baby on her chest. When a mom is in her pushing phase, if she still has clothes on, I'm pretty annoying about like, hey, let's take your bra off the next time you have a break. Let's get this puppy off because it's way more complicated to do that once the baby's there and you're like stuck in a weird position and it's just more complicated. And usually they're like, cut it off. And if we could just get it off easily with pushing, that's a good time to do it. But anyway, warmth, which includes the feet. Holding the feet can feel really grounding. That's an easy one to do if she's not in the water. And that's a great place for me to position myself because I'm not like all up in it with her and the baby and the partner. So I'll often just go down to where her feet are. And, I'm still kind of in the field. This is only when I'm feeling like she needs some support in regulating. Otherwise, I'm pretty backdrop, but holding the feet or even putting socks on her feet, having a blanket or a towel around her torso, baby staying on her chest. Um, in some cases, I've had her put her legs up, but that's only really two times that I can think of where that felt like the right thing to do. Um, getting some bone broth in her system. Maybe I already have that going in the kitchen. Um, and just talking with her because women are very capable of explaining what's happening. And her being able to look at me and say something is really helpful for me to gauge kind of how far out she is, because then it's also worth mentioning there's the spiritual context of, she might not fully land back in her body for days. And that's okay as long as like everything is okay, as long as she feels okay. Um, but holding that kind of shamanic space too of she doesn't have to be fully back in the room yet. She's still in an altered state, and that's great. There's a real magic to that. And then like Yo said, I just want to be really clear about this. The vast majority of excessive bleeding is going to occur from baby out to placenta when the placenta's still in. That's just like the majority of the time. And yes, it can happen once the placenta's out, but that's way less common. And so getting the placenta out is ultimately going to be what curtails the bleeding and resolves, in any dysregulation physically. There might still be energetics to tend to. And so, like Yo said, what's so significant about this that I don't see in medical midwifery is how to do that with so much ease and grace and groundedness. It just is so imperative that you're the anchor of the room that's so relaxed. And like Yo always says about this spell casting, I've seen births where it did feel like a lot of blood. And I have had plenty of moms look up at me and go, "Is this okay?" And I'll say something like, um, "That looks like the perfect amount." And it's just like, boom, like done, Or one of my first births, it was with a traditional midwife. I was the family member, and she was birthed on a birth stool, and a lot of blood was coming out after baby, before placenta. And the midwife looked at her and looked in her eyes and said, "I want you to tell your body to stop bleeding now." But she did it calmly. It wasn't dramatic. It could have been. And this woman closed her eyes, and I was watching her vagina, and it just stopped. And I've used that trick, you could say, or spell,
Mhm.
so much since, because it really is that simple when you're that anchored and when you're that, it's not just like unafraid. It's like when you actually respect women's ability to regulate. The best tool you have in the room is the woman's own mind.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. I've often said, um, just statements that are true, like your bleeding's going to subside very soon.
Hmm.
You'll find, and it really it is a spell, and it
I
works.
remember that in my first birth, looking up at my friend and being like, I was like, "How does my bleeding look?" I think is what I said. And took a little look, and she said, "It looks great." And it just felt so good to hear that. It's like, "Oh, okay, great."
Yeah.
And that sweetness and that vulnerability is so shit on in the system. It's so taken advantage of, and it's so twisted. It's just so upsetting, because it's so epic as a birth attendant to be given that kind of trust, that the woman looks at you and asks you this really important question that's going to shape her next hour. It's going to shape her whole field, what you say. God, that's just such a big responsibility, and there's so much trust. All right. I think we covered a lot of ground.
We covered a lot of ground. I think we should maybe do an episode on supporting the birth of the placenta, because that's very much tied to this topic, and it's a whole topic unto itself as well. So maybe someday.
I guess the last thing that's on my mind that maybe we didn't fully flesh out is just that it's really all of our individual work to do, of fear of blood. And I know so many women, when they have a miscarriage, because miscarriage is so not normalized and no one talks about it, and everyone goes into the system to have these brutal extractions of their uterine lining, it's all very dramatic. And what I find that women don't understand or know about miscarriage is that it's often a lot of blood, like a
It's a
lot
birth.
more. Right.
It is birth.
It's
Yeah.
a lot more, not always, but often it seems. I haven't had one myself, but I've supported plenty. It's a lot more blood than one may expect. And so many women make up when they see that much blood that they're having a hemorrhage, because that's the cultural story that if you are dumb enough to allow your pregnancy to release at home, you little lady have no idea how close you're going to be. How would you even know? You're going to bleed out and die and leave your whole family. This is the story that women are still holding and perpetuating and making be true. And again, women will tell me their miscarriage stories, and it's like, oh, yeah, yeah, totally. Lots of blood. Oh, went on for days. Oh, it stopped during the day and it happened at night, multiple nights. Yep, that's just what miscarriage can be. But they believe that they are dying, and they go to the hospital and have these you know, really dramatic extractions so that they can continue walking with this really dramatic story that they are uniquely broken and that they uniquely hemorrhaged. Ah, it's just like, okay, I mean, this isn't going to sound very sensitive, but like, you're welcome to do that. You're welcome to make up, as you do, whatever dramatic, unique stories you have about yourself and your body. And I have so much respect for the women who are willing to really question them and really think about it and really try on different possibilities, because
Mm. And to
it's
really ask themselves that very hard question of what is it that I'm actually getting out of carrying this story with me? Why am
right,
I cultivating this identity as a woman whose body doesn't function?
right.
Because there's a lot of cookies actually in that.
And it's so deep, right? Like, to be afraid of our own blood, like what an epic, successful, brilliant, uh, what's the right word? Campaign. Like, get women afraid of their most primal life force. Damn. Like, boom, there's the last 10,000 years, like, wow, that was really successful, which is why, we had Nancy and Kristen on this season to talk about these micro shifts of how do we come into right relationship with our blood, and what are ritualistic, or affirmational, things we can do with our monthly blood to reclaim and reorient to a positive relationship, because birth is often bloody. Early birth, miscarriage, of course, would involve blood, and none of that is wrong or bad. But if you keep a woman scared of her blood, I mean, industrial birth lives on. Okay, well, we did it. We should do the placenta episode next season. If you are listening to this in real time, we are enrolling for a few more weeks in the Radical Birth Keeper School. And that is a program we have done many times over since 2020. And it's new and improved, got a facelift, and lots of you have already enrolled. Yeah, I just really invite you to come do this dive with us. It's really the best of what Yo and I both have to offer. This was a little taster of that. Um, it's a lot of deprogramming, as I'm sure you're aware if you listen to this podcast. And you also know from listening to this podcast what is possible in the live women who are willing to deprogram. So join us. Anything you want to add?
You covered it. Can't wait.
When the world knows responsible birth attendance, I mean, culture really changes, right? And in the cultures where I've seen the microcultures where responsible, integrity-based midwives have shown up and started serving, it's pretty incredible to see how a whole community can change. How free birth or sovereign birth, midwife attended birth, births of sovereign birth paradigm start to kind of be contagious, right? I've seen women's circles, like one woman births in a sovereign way and then starts
Mhm.
attending, and then within 3 years everyone is doing that, and how that impacts the rest of the family current. it's so exciting and cool. And that's part of what's at the heart of the Radical Birth Keeper School, is if you're called to um, be in responsibility with how you serve women and how you hold the energetics of birth, in a birth, and also with coaching and with education and all the stuff, probably so many of you are lit up to do. We're happy to teach you what we've worked really hard to figure out. It's kind of yeah, what's the word I'm looking for? No one taught this, to me, and I learned it with blood, sweat, and tears. And not that you get out of that, you still have to have your own lived experience. But I do think this puts you on a much faster track of evolution with birth work, getting a program like this.
No, definitely. We've both distilled our triumphs and failures into a program that will definitely equip women to step into this work, and it's growing like wildfire. I think there's really no other area of life that's more important, especially now, given everything that's happening in the world.
All right. So join us, radicalbirthkeeperschool.com. You can learn all about it. And thank you, Yo. Thanks for your time. I love you.
Love you too.
Bye. I hope you enjoyed the show today. You can support this podcast by donating to it on freebirthsociety.com and leaving an awesome review on whatever platform you listen on. The more reviews, the more visibility the show gets, so let's spread the word of sovereign birth. We've always got a lot going on at Free Birth Society, and you can find out about all of it at freebirthsociety.com, at Free Birth Society on Instagram, and opt in to my newsletter below in the show notes. We offer courses on free birth, authentic midwifery, and the blood mysteries, as well as one-on-one coaching, in-person retreats, and of course, our annual Women's Festival. Our exclusive, vetted, private membership is definitely something to check out if you're looking for a community of wise sisters. Together we rise. We must speak our stories, claim our lives, and support one another. This is the living revolution, and I am so grateful to be in it with all of you. I'll leave you with our epic Free Birth Society theme song, Wild Woman by Aruba Red.
I honor you for the wisdom you held, the ancient traditions of plant medicine and womb magic. I feel the spirit of the ancestors as I place my hands upon my belly. This sacred portal will be honored. Eons upon light beams of survival, withstanding the eradication of our power by design. I will not allow the separation of our young to be forced upon me. My sisters will no longer birth in captivity. The picket line redefined from burning our wild women to paralyzing us and drugging our babes. Strapped down in a clinical white bed, drying up the milk from our breasts. Keep your needles. My family will never again be doomed to chase those dragons or your poison. We reject your fear. We choose love. Everything with intention. Death, ascension. I will fly